George Harrison's track Not Guilty was part of his contribution to the Beatles' iconic White Album, but the verdict from the rest of the band was a negative one, and despite more than 100 takes, more than 100 attempts to nail the track, it didn't make the cut. Why not? Not Guilty was the product of one of the Beatles' most creative periods. It was a result of their stay at the Maharishi's spiritual retreat in Rishikesh. Harrison, of course, had been driving the idea that the Beatles should go to India. India was for him an obsession throughout his life. When he got back from India, he recorded a demo of Not Guilty, and it appeared on the Isha demo tapes, which were the preparation for what eventually became the White Album. It was a difficult song to play and record, which accounts for the fact that there were more than 100 takes. You have to compare that, of course, to 26 takes for Strawberry Fields Forever. So the Beatles spent a lot of time on the track, despite the fact that it never even appeared on the White Album. Harrison himself, according to those present, struggled to nail the vocal. It seemed that he wasn't really feeling it, despite the fact, of course, that the band pursued it for more than 100 takes, so there clearly was a level of commitment to getting it done. But Harrison seemed not to be particularly content with the way it was being recorded. In the end, he recorded the vocal in the control room of the studio. He felt that that created the kind of sound that he wanted. So what's Not Guilty about? Well, the lyric is really an exercise in self-defense by Harrison. He says, "I'm really sorry that you're underfed, but like you heard me said, I'm not guilty. Not guilty for looking like a freak making friends with every Sikh. Not guilty for leading you astray on the road to Mandalay. I won't upset the apple cart. I only want what I can get." Harrison is talking here in coded terms about the fallout from the trip to India, to the Maharishi's retreat. It hadn't ended entirely happily. Lennon suspected that the Maharishi was having inappropriate relations with some of the female residents of the retreat. That was the rumour that was doing the rounds, and he was beginning to suspect that the Maharishi wasn't really all he was cracked up to be. He wasn't the solution that Lennon was looking for. He had hoped that the trip to Rishikesh would provide him and the others with the meaning of life. He was aiming a little too high, and of course Lennon later wrote Sexy Sadie, in itself a coded takedown of the Maharishi, whom he couldn't name for legal reasons, so in the song he becomes Sexy Sadie. Harrison felt that the others were possibly blaming him, or at least that Lennon and McCartney were blaming him for India, which had turned into a bit of a fiasco. They felt the Maharishi had been a hoax, and so when Harrison talks about how it wasn't his fault, he's not guilty, that's what he's referring to. And upsetting the apple cart is a reference to the Beatles' business, of course, Apple. McCartney had left India early to go back and take care of business at Apple. When Harrison got back, he was disturbed to witness some of the excesses, as he saw them, of the Apple operation. It was, in his view, out of control, and of course there's a lot of evidence that it was. The spending was unchecked. And it may be that Harrison was raising the alarm about this, and the others at that point were not listening to him. That might explain the reference to the apple cart that Harrison references in Not Guilty. In his 1980 memoir, I, Me, Mine, Harrison confirms that Not Guilty was about Paul, John, Apple, Rishikesh and Indian friends. So why were the others opposed to its inclusion on the White Album? Well, there's some evidence that John Lennon liked the song, that George Martin was also a fan. But in the end, they decided that they didn't want to air the Beatles' dirty laundry in public, and that's why it was kept off the album. It had featured in one of the initial track listings or proposed track listings and then fell out of contention. In the late 1970s, Harrison appeared in The Ruttles, Eric Idle's comedy, a parody of the Beatle years, a process that he enjoyed, and it got him thinking about the Beatles. He was happy poking fun at himself and at their legacy, and of course he was looking at that time to publish his memoir, going through old song fragments, and stumbled upon Not Guilty. It was re-recorded and appeared in 1979. Tellingly, it was a much simpler recording. The difficult changing time signatures had gone, and this was a relatively mellow and jazzy version. Harrison said that he had always liked the tune and it would be perfect for someone like Peggy Lee. The Beatle producer George Martin had been a skeptic about the idea of a double album. The idea of a much simpler, shorter album appealed to him, perhaps one with 15 tracks, and there's some speculation that if that had happened, then Not Guilty might have made the track listing. But perhaps it's unlikely, given that Lennon and McCartney were against it. You might think there was a case of double standards here because, of course, Sexy Sadie was also a coded song, a clever takedown in thinly veiled language of the Maharishis. So Lennon's song, reflecting on the Indian experience in a slightly coded way, did make the track listing, and not Harrison's. But of course, Harrison's was aimed at Lennon and McCartney. Lennon was at least attacking someone outside the Beatles. It wasn't until 1996 that Not Guilty in its original form, or one of its takes, appeared on Beatles Anthology. And then it would be 2018 when the deluxe reissue of the White Album came out that fans were able to hear take 102 and indeed the demo version of Not Guilty.